Hi, everybody. How are you doing tonight? I appreciate an enthusiastic response. Thank you. Thank you to those of you in the room joining us. Thank you to those of you watching online for joining us as well. However you're with us, I'm very glad you're here. My name is Aidan Flax-Clark, and I'm part of the team that brings you live from NYPL. And I also have the distinct honor of moderating tonight's panel. And we have quite a group with us, so I'm going to bring them up as quick as I can. Tonight's conversation is the annual Richard B. Salomon Distinguished Lecture. The lecture is made possible by an endowment established by the family of the late Richard B. Salomon, who was a former chairman of the library's Board of Trustees, and we are extremely grateful to his family and friends for making this annual event possible. And I suppose it's no surprise that we picked a pretty library-centric event for this year's entry to the lecture series. We're marking 3 years since the city's shut down, and we're doing that by looking back at the early days of the pandemic through the lens of various projects that sought to capture and reflect that time. And first and foremost is a remarkable project that some of my library colleagues here put together called the Pandemic Diaries, which you're going to learn about tonight. But basically, you know, as the pandemic transformed lives across the city, the Pandemic Diaries invited people to submit via an online form audio recordings of themselves or their loved ones talking about their personal stories and their experiences of life amid the pandemic. But you will learn a lot more from someone who actually worked on it. And, you know, just as the library was doing this project, all kinds of writers and artists were doing similar work in different mediums, but similar in that they were wrestling with the same time, similar issues, even the same place here in New York City. And we're lucky to have some of those folks with us tonight. Jeremiah Moss is the author of Feral City, Finding Liberation in Lockdown New York, which I'm happy to report was just longlisted for a Lambda Literary Award. So congratulations, Jeremiah. Yeah, give it up. Also, it's available for sale in the back of the room, so if you're interested, please purchase a copy. I believe we also have a library tote bag back there that you can check out. And of course, if you have a library card, which I'm sure everybody does, I'm not going to find a person without a library card in this room, you can also check it out there. Camilo José Vergara is a photographer and the creator of a different project called Pandemic Diary. And we also have with us Julia Kwon, an artist who created a beautiful series of masks called Unapologetically Asian. You have all the speakers' complete bios in your printed programs. If you're watching online, it's on the event listing. I encourage you to read their very, very impressive biographies. Okay, all of tonight's speakers are gonna take some questions from you at the end if you have questions you'd like to ask them. Here in the room, you have note cards to write down your questions, and some of my colleagues will come by to pick them up later on. If you're watching online, you can put your question in the chat, or you can email publicprograms@nypl.org. So wherever you are, we'd love to hear some of your questions. Live from NYPL is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Isbahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos, and of course by all of you, all of our supporters, wherever you are. Thank you to everyone for your support. Again, thank you very much for being here, and please join me in welcoming Julie Golia, Julia Kwon, Jeremiah Moss, and Camilo José Vergara. Hello, everybody.
Hey, Aidan.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us. And I'd like to get right to it, if we could, and you know, I'm going to take library privilege and start with the library project, the Pandemic Diaries. And I thought, Julie, maybe we could hear a clip from it, if that's right, and then I can ask you some questions about it. Fair warning, this is a tough clip to listen to, but I think reflective of, you know, the time. So if we could hear audio clip 1, please.
Hi, my name is JD, and I lost my father in the COVID pandemic, and I want to talk about that experience. My father was 80 years old, so he had been living in a nursing home in Coney Island since 2016. And on April 10th, 2020, I received a call from the nursing home that my father had COVID symptoms, difficulty breathing, and that they put him on a respirator and took him to Coney Island Hospital. By that early afternoon, later that same day, the doctor from the hospital called me to tell me that my father had passed away. My father passed away while he was still in the emergency room, or hadn't fully been processed. So he hadn't been tested for COVID. So officially on his death certificate, there's no cause of death. My husband, Sean, had a very nice idea of making a memorial plaque on one of the benches on the boardwalk near the nursing home where in these last 4 years I often went to sit with my dad and look at the ocean. We made a very nice memorial service on the beach at Coney Island, and committed my father's ashes to the ocean.
So, Julie, can you tell us a little bit about what we were listening to and the collection that it comes from and how it came into existence?
Sure. We, on March 13th or whatever it was, when things began to go down, as an institution that is committed to documenting as many aspects of the human experience as possible, we knew we had to begin to think about how we were going to collect this period. And I think we were all struck by kind of the polarized narrative that the political atmosphere had taken over in terms of COVID, when I think, in fact, and I suspect all of you may feel this as well, we were looking around our neighborhoods and seeing a totally different story. We were seeing human stories, we were seeing people dying, we were seeing people helping people, we were seeing people chipping in around their neighborhoods to help businesses. And I remember saying, how are we going to chronicle this, the on-the-ground experience? Being the New York Public Library, I think we wanted to get as many stories as possible and pull our net as widely as possible. And that's how we settled on this idea of catching stories, essentially, setting up as simple a system as possible to allow people to give to the library the gift of their pandemic story. The clip that we just listened to, I think, indicates how diverse and powerful so many of these stories were. Many, like this one, were elegies, were moments of mourning that were stolen away from people whose loved ones had died. We also got funny stories, we got poetry, we got music, we got anger, we got politics, we got parenting, and everything in between, in a way that I think captures the fact that COVID affected virtually every aspect of our lives.
Yeah, I remember when we talked last week, you told me that chronicling grief was kind of one of these big themes that emerged from what you heard. Were there other kind of similarly big themes that leapt out across all of the recordings? Maybe
it is my own coloring of the experience, but I think that the experience of parenting during the pandemic was a huge theme. The struggles that people were dealing with their children, the logistics of it, but also I think the psychological concerns and trauma that the experience might have had on children was a really fascinating theme. I also think the 7 o'clock cheer was a wonderful thing. I can't wait for somebody to write that article where they listen to all the stories of the 7 o'clock cheers that took place all over the city. And then I think one of the really fascinating things was that having collected over the course of a year, we got to witness in real time the transformation of mood, the terror of the early years, the respite of the summer, the darkness of the fall and winter, and then the dawning of the vaccine. I think, again, many may have had this experience, but so many stories of people saying that they wanting to chronicle when they received the vaccine and how powerful that was. Even now, that seems like a million years ago, doesn't it?
Yeah, although, I mean, that's one of my personal favorite stories is talking about being at the Javits Center, getting the vaccine. It felt like such a massive collective experience to do it there, so I get it. So this is not, it's not exactly an oral history collection, right? What makes it different from your sort of typical oral history?
You know, oral history, I think, seeks to go really deep. Like, if anyone has listened to an oral history or done an oral history, they might take 2 hours. You usually start from the beginning of your life to the end. And I think we wanted to actually go wide on this, right? And so instead of tracking people down and interviewing them and guiding them through it, we allowed people to kind of tell the story on their own terms. It makes it a little complicated too. You don't know what you're gonna get. And in a lot of cases, we got some really surprising things. They're not as narrative maybe as an oral history might be, not as guided. But in some ways, that's the beauty of it, right? Is that each one is unique in its own remarkable way. They say something as a whole in addition to each one having their own story.
And just, if you can give us a sense of, how many recordings there are, where people came from, like what is the scope of what came in that one day people can use for their research?
Yep, we received 288 submissions. I got to listen to 288 of them. When I listened to all of them. We got many languages. Obviously English was the largest, Spanish was the second, quite a significant Spanish language presence thanks to some really wonderful outreach that we did to Spanish-speaking communities. It chronicled a year, essentially. And at the time, I think with vaccines coming onto the scene and that summer having so much hope, I think there is something really fascinating in what we chronicled was that we thought maybe it was over.
Right.
We thought the project should wind down, and so we put it on pause in the summer of 2021, thinking that this was a new phase of COVID, which of course it was, but it didn't end. And so in a lot of ways, this is not a chronicle of COVID writ large. It's just a chronicle of one short year in the story of COVID.
Yeah, but that's what makes it fascinating. And related to Jeremiah's book, of course, which also chronicles just about the same year. I wonder if, Camilo, I can turn to you for a second. Julie mentioned kind of grief emerging as a big theme, and I know you talked about on the Library of Congress website, where many of your photographs reside, that grief was a huge theme, that, of course, that you encountered among quite a few. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about some of the other themes that you tried to highlight as you went across neighborhoods all over the city for 3 years, taking upwards of 5,000 pictures of life during the pandemic. And maybe while you do that, we can see some of those photographs while you tell us about some of the themes that emerged in your work.
Sure.
So if we could bring up the slideshow of Camilo's photographs, please.
Well, the pandemic started, and I wanted to see what was going to do. That picture that you just saw there was a terror. And it's the kind of, the difference that I saw immediately was that you can see terror once a year, but here you would see it every day. And people very scared and trying to protect their families. And this happened in the subways. The composition of the people on the crossroads where I went to photograph changed. Street vendors disappeared. It was at the beginning was mostly males, and then there was women too, and then the street vendors disappear, and then they started coming, selling, masks and sanitizer. I was very impressed with all those signs, that you write really quickly, and your lettering falls as it gets written. That's Times Square. Times Square was desolated, and I got the urban cowboy, or whatever they call him. And there he was. The subways, they had like one car was for the homeless. So it was like the homeless could claim this place, and they wouldn't be moved out. The cops would go by, and they would knock with their keys on the door, and sometimes it would offer them water. And that's the last picture, which I selected because it was it represented COVID today, which is basically a thing that affects mostly to people who have who don't have immunity and are elderly, like myself, and there were things like the signs that you see. You see the schools closing, and then the school door becomes like a full of different signs, and all saying each more complicated thing, and you figure, how are people going to understand this? And then you saw all of these places that would give free food, like what you're looking at now. And people would come and get some food. And for a while, the kids would feel that everything was over. That was like in beginning of May. And there they go on their bikes on the street in the Bronx. And of course, the food delivery people, which sort of jumped from something like 60,000 to 80,000, 90,000 or more. And the times that it went, with the hope we felt, everything is behind us, now we're okay, and then it would come back again. And in those in-between times when people were feeling better about the whole thing, there were certain places that they probably were dreaming about because they had some special foods that they could access, or some special music that they hadn't heard, so you had these Ecuadorians there getting together in Corona Park. Those are people who died, and those are their own pictures, and their pictures, a lot of them are immigrants and work in restaurants and hotels and places like that. And those were people who worked for the subway that, of course, died of COVID. It was sort of interesting to see that the word COVID was hardly ever mentioned. And that's the view of the virus. I mean, you had to point out, you had to find out who was doing this to you. So it was this thing, and then there were many other versions of it that I saw.
Camilo, could you give us a sense of what your days were like going out? What was the geography that you covered? How did you pick your spots that you went to? How did you travel? How many places did you go in a day? I'm fascinated to know.
Well, before I started this project, I had a project called Crossroads, which I published in this thing that had to do with the Atlantic, city something. And I would go to different crossroads in the city and in Newark, and also Patterson. And I figured that was, the crossroads are places that bring a lot of people. So, subway lines go there, bus lines go there. There are a lot of places that sell different products. And so there are a lot of people there. So if you want to get sort of a view that it's instant and right in front of you, the crossroads are like the places to go. So I would do one day of the week to each crossroad. And I would go for months. I would go every day, and I would see the changes. I mean, those buses, it took a while for them to hit the crossroads, those big buses. Then I would see people in the gypsy cabs, just putting stuff like that so that the air was clean in the back. This, in a way, was very depressing and scary. That's the way people were buying cheap clothes, And you figure this is in the middle of Omicron. And you figure, what is this? So I took those pictures and then I left, and then they would follow me around on the streets.
The people would follow you around?
Yeah, they would follow me. They thought I was going to bring the cops, and have the clothes or something. And of course, there was the Black Lives Matter movement too that was everywhere, and marking the city. And, the city was closing a lot of the windows were covered for a while. And the poor people that were collecting cans, can collectors, the number of them increased tremendously. That's somebody that died and worked for a hotel. And he died of COVID, and they accepted that he died of COVID. Most of the time they would say, oh, he had something to the lungs. He had lung cancer. And the amazing masks that I would see. And the people were proud of this thing. After a while, you had the pandemic, but also that was a chance to show your aesthetic side. And of course, the people that opposed this whole thing and called it a hoax. And here at the end of the pandemic, this was like, at the end of the pandemic. This was when things were calming down. Like
one of the ends of the pandemic.
Yeah. Then they come up with the stuff that they will give you money for the people who died, So you could apply, you could get all your papers if you could get the papers together.
Yeah.
And then they would give you the money to pay for the funeral.
Yeah.
So that's the...
Thank you very much. Jeremiah, I want to turn to you and something that both Camilo and Julie talked about was change, which I feel like was a big theme in Feral City. You talk a lot about change in yourself, change in your neighborhood, change in daily interactions, and then how all of that changed again, and changed again. And so I'm just going to keep saying the word change over and over. But I wonder if you could talk about what your experience of change was in the pandemic, and also how you decided to write about it in your book.
Sure. Yeah, it seemed like the city was changing every week. It felt sometimes like a different city. I wrote a lot about change prior to this, about hyper-gentrification, and that's where Feral City kind of starts, with the experience of feeling really alienated in my neighborhood in the East Village, in my part of the city. And then, around March 13th, 15th, lockdown started, and everything changed overnight. We all woke up to this empty city. And I found that emptiness invited people and human expressions that had really been pushed out of the gentrified city, certainly. And there were much more, homeless folks, more people who were, you could sort of see people, I couldn't really figure out, am I seeing people that I couldn't see before because all these other people were obscuring them, or are people feeling more comfortable being out in public, which was sort of unexpected, right? Because a lot of people certainly were inside, but we were also told, well, you can be outside if you're alone. And so there were all these people walking around alone, or I was on my bike, and this experience of the commons, of the public space, really came back to life, especially in May. But it started before that. Camilo, you had your picture of Times Square and the naked cowboy up there. It was, there were times I would go to Times Square and I would count like 12 people. And then by Easter, more and more people were coming into Times Square, local people, sort of like working class people of color coming in, and McDonald's was the one place where you could get food, and people would get food and eat outside. And then this sort of new kind of culture started springing up, and then in Washington Square Park, just burst into life in May with artists and people coming from parts of the city to Washington Square Park who had never come before. And so many young artists putting their work out on the ground and on easels and meeting each other. And, it's in many ways, I feel like Feral City is a sort of like counter history to the story of alienation, which a lot of people experience. But for me, it was lockdown was an experience of incredible connection. I met people, I was with people more than I am in my regular life. Making new friends and getting involved in the Black Lives Matter movement. And it was just really, in some ways, an incredibly alive time in a time of death. And I think, as time has gone on and I think about that, I grieve the loss of, certainly not the pandemic itself, but the experience of collectively being in the moment together and feeling like there was space and time to be kind to one another. The free food and the community refrigerators and the free stores and the sense of like just this kind of caretaking of one another that was so moving, and something that happened after 9/11 for a very brief moment, but because of the pandemic, how long it went on, this experience went on and on and on.
And do you think that there are any traces of that remain, or do you feel like it's all kind of just receded to as was?
There are a few traces.
Yeah.
There are still mutual aid groups that are active. Washington Square Park Mutual Aid is one that I'm involved in every Friday night in the park, and other groups in Brooklyn and around the city. But I've seen this return of, I think of it as this concept of internalized capitalism I find really useful. This return of this kind of like, competition and scarcity and this kind of dog-eat-dog mentality that we've gone back to. And I think I often want to cry because I walk through the city and I think, how could we go back to this? We had something, we were able to access something that was so humane, and we've let it go. Why did we let it go? And of course, the forces are powerful, right? So we let it go. But I just, it makes me very sad and angry.
Well,
We've let it go.
Sorry to ask you a question that brings up sadness.
No, I'm okay with that. I know we were talking in the green room earlier about the forgetting that's happening around the pandemic and the importance of pandemic diaries and oral histories. And so, I think everybody here, I just want to say thank you for being among the people who want to remember, who find the importance of remembering.
Yeah. It's hard to remember, right? Julie and I talked about this last week. This, part of what feels crucial about all of these projects is that we live, even before the pandemic, in, the like daily onslaught of like mega loads of information that you can't process, can't remember, and then add that with a pandemic. It's what I think makes all of these projects so valuable, is that they all mark this period in time. Yeah. That, we need to mark because I can't remember, and I'm trying,
Sure, yeah.
The other question I wanted to ask you, Jeremiah, sort of connected to this is visibility. You talk a lot about visibility in the book, and from literally people who don't see you and bump into you on the street, and then people who are more polite than that, over to sort of visibility during the pandemic about yourself, your identity as a trans man, being more politically engaged, someone who really loves the word fuck. There's just all these pieces of you that in the reading of the book feel like they really sounded like they emerged more, and that you felt happy to share with the people that you were meeting. And then there's sort of the ebb of that, the flow and the ebb. So I just wanted to ask you kind of what that experience was like, and how you managed that flow and ebb of the changing
sure.
visibility.
Yeah. I'm thinking about where to enter that question. So, one of the things I talk about in the book is the way that normativity has a policing function, and a policing function on all of us, right? And what happened to the city, especially after the 1990s and after Giuliani and then Bloomberg came in, with hyper-gentrification comes this normalization of space and of the city and of human behavior. And I always thought of New York as a place that was not normal, that was outside the norms of America. And then what happened in the pandemic was it sort of like denormalized. And a lot of the people who carry normativity and consciously or unconsciously enforce normativity had fled. And when they were gone, the people who are outside the center reclaimed the center of the city. So you had queer people, trans people, people of color, poor people, homeless people, people with visible mental illness, lots of kinds of people suddenly were the center of the city again. And as a trans person, I found this to be incredibly liberating. I found myself much less constricted in how I just felt moving through the streets without the gaze of the normative upon me. And I know that a lot of other people felt that way too. And I felt more in my body than I had, which again is like, how do you feel more in your body in a time when your body is so vulnerable to breathing the air, right? And yet I felt more in my body than I did before, and than I do now, right? Because it's gone back, and I feel again this constriction, and a lot of people feel that too, and have left. When you go into the public spaces that were so diverse in every sense of the word, they are no longer. People no longer feel comfortable. The normative has come back with very much the help of the NYPD, clamping down on these spaces, arresting people, bullying people, rioting against people. And so people don't want any part of it anymore.
Yeah.
And so we've lost these spaces once again, in many ways.
Julia, I wanted to ask you about visibility as well, because I feel like that felt like a big theme in this series of masks you made called Unapologetically Asian. And I was just wondering if you can talk about how visibility played into the creation of this project and what else these beautiful masks represented for you. And maybe while we do that, we could see picture 5 so we can get a sense of what some of these masks look like as well.
Yeah, I've been working with textiles and thinking about how I'm perceived out in the world a lot. I normally don't, but then if I am out in the world, people will remind me how I'm different. And so that's when I'm sort of reminded of how I look or how I'm perceived by others. And so that's been very much, on my mind as I'm in the studio. With this series, I really didn't think that it would become a series, strangely. I was just hearing a lot of news from friends and family members, but also just on the news of anti-Asian rhetoric coming from everyday people, but also people in high places, right? Politicians in official, with official titles, right? And so it was really jarring to be in that space and to learn all these different incidents that were coming from many from New York City, but all around the world. I think it was a lot more intense in the city probably because you don't have a lot of private space or the sense of private space or safety. I'm from Northern Virginia, so I feel a little bit safer because I can get into my car, get to the grocery store, come back into my car, right? I can take my mask off. But then, if you're taking public transportation, that sense of safety is really taken from you. And so I've been hearing a lot of, violence committed in just everyday places on the street or when you're waiting for this train to come, and that was coming from, again, news, but also just friends and family members who are living in the city and elsewhere too, that, I was processing that, and I think I'm still processing that. I think that's what we were talking about before we came on here. And that's what sort of, inspired me to create this mask, one mask. And I made that, and then I didn't share it for a while because I was still processing what it meant to me. And then like a week or so later, I did share it on Instagram, just, saying this is the title. I didn't think, again, that it was going to be a series, but that this was a piece that I had to make. And it's, inspired by a Korean object wrapping cloth, like patchwork textile history, and I've been working in that manner. But with this one, it's the process is more improvisational. I'm just creating them using certain patterns, and I'm embracing just the materiality and what that means to me, right? And so it symbolizes, my ethnic background. And so I'm celebrating it. It is also a confrontation of anti-Asian rhetoric, right? And sentiment and all this violence that I'm hearing about. And so that was sort of my way of like celebrating and sort of reclaiming my identity without having to be invisible to feel safe. And so that's what sort of inspired the work, and it sort of expanded naturally after that. But it really honestly wasn't started to become like an official series.
I love that not only is it not invisible, these are such like beautiful, visible, vibrant colors. They really kind of, make themselves seen in a really lovely way. I love that. And maybe we could see picture one, just to get a sense of your other work in this sort of object wrapping tradition. I believe there's in the first image, right? So I did not know anything about this tradition, and so I'm going to assume perhaps there's another person in the room who might not as well. Could you just talk a little bit about what this tradition is, where it comes from, and how it was used?
Yeah, so it's been started roughly, or since the Joseon Dynasty, so 1392, up until now, and it isn't as widely used. But mainly you would use the diagonal corners to wrap everyday or precious objects, to carry around like a bag or store away, to keep safe. Some of them are used on like food. So it has a lot of like use, everyday use, but they're meant for objects. And so I've been working in this format, and in this case, an enlarged object wrapping cloth. So they're typically square. So I'll sort of reference that shape over and over again throughout different pieces. And so, I created this larger piece to wrap, literally objectify, a person, to talk about, the seriousness and also the absurdity of objectification and dehumanization of a human being.
Something that I found interesting about these masks is that, sort of everyone else has been talking about projects that are like kind of quite literally diaries, and obviously making masks is not a diary, but there's something feels similar to a diary in that these masks very much mark a specific time in a very distinct way. And you had told me a little bit about that, sort of this moment in time. How does this mark the beginning of the pandemic for you in other ways?
Yeah. I created the first piece, I guess, earlier on in the pandemic. And then after that, it was still at a time when mask wearing wasn't normalized. Being aware of Korean culture and other Asian cultures, for me, it wasn't super foreign. The idea that you would wear a mask outdoors, right, outside in public spaces, for many different reasons, not just because you're sick, but also because of climate change. Some places it is more normal. And I think, at the time that was not the case. And so there was a lot of need for just masks in general. Whether they were high quality or not. And so at the time it was created more so in the fashion of like rapid response. And that was when I created many of the pieces. And again, we were talking about change. It changed pretty quickly. And so, different supplies, it became a little bit more readily available. We had more information, and so I think people did switch, to higher quality masks, and that was available. And so it was at a very particular, earlier stage in the pandemic when, that mask wearing wasn't normalized.
Yeah, and sort of reflected in one of Camilo's photographs too, this particular moment when mask style was a thing, which kind of seems to have quite gone by the wayside.
Yeah.
And a mechanism for political statements too.
Yeah.
So we acquired one of Julia's beautiful masks, and it's now part of the library's collection. I think we collected it. We collected masks in a lot of different ways. Julia's and many others were both pieces that could be worn, but also statements and works of art, right? But we also collected masks that were pro-Trump or pro-Biden masks, or a lot of things that people were buying off of Etsy at the time. I mean, we forget that people were making masks out of their T-shirts and things like that. Some of the early masks that we collected fit really weird. Do you remember how masks fit really weird? That's
bad.
not a thing that we think about today because it's become part of our capitalist system, if you will. So I think that was such a weird, specific moment in the nature of mask writing, mask creation.
I would want to add one thing.
Yeah.
It's that at the very beginning, you had the blue masks, the surgical masks, and very few people could use the other, the N95 masks. But at the very beginning, it just took 6 weeks for people to realize that the mask went with the glasses, and it went with the glasses that went with the hoodie. So you had the mask in itself was one component of a new presence that you had that was due to the pandemic. So you had dark aviator glasses, that was the classic thing, and the mask. And then you play with that. Then it came the country of origin mask. So if you were Puerto Rican, you had the Puerto Rican flag, Dominican, the Dominican flag, and so on, and so forth.
I also wanted to add, it was when many people were trying to make their own masks, and so I did have to wait until my elastics came, and that took forever, right? And I made it out of canvas because I have an interdisciplinary practice, and so I had canvases for painting, and so after a lot of research, right, that was what was effective out of what I had and what we had. So it was such a very distinct time in the pandemic where there were lack of elastics. Who would have guessed, And so that was when I was creating these pieces.
And maybe we could pull up picture 6 just to see a few more. I'm starting to get some questions from the audience, so we'll turn to those in a second. But one thing I guess I wanted to ask, kind of put to the group, is that one of the things that I think all of these projects share is that they all really relate pretty deeply to community and communal experience. And, as isolating as the pandemic was for a lot of people, wherever we were and whatever we were doing, whether we knew it or not, we were all doing this together, right? We were all going through this experience together. And it was a collective experience. And it just, thinking about that and thinking about your projects, it made me wonder whether there were ideas about community, about collective experience that you hope get out into the world from these various endeavors. Yeah, please.
I just want to be the discordant voice here.
Please.
Because what happened very often is that the people in the subway cars, in the buses, on the streets, were very nervous because you could give them the virus. So in a sense, surely there was the community. I'm not denying that there was a community, but you or any human being that came close to you, even the people you love, could give you COVID. So that was a reality that you couldn't escape. Plus, the COVID exacerbated the horror of being homeless. So if you were homeless, you had no bathrooms, you had no place to go and take showers and stuff. So there they were raging, and they were raging mad, you know. So that, I mean, the two things coexisted. The tremendous distrust, this feeling that you were in a situation that you couldn't understand, and in addition to that, that nobody else understood. And, and that, you know, you couldn't get close and hug somebody and say, look, give me some consolation or some love or some stuff like that. I mean, you kind of, but I think this kind of thing, you know, every time I got on the subways, I sort of wanted to sort of get into the people, so I stare at them. And I made a lot of people mad. Says, why are you staring at me, MF? You know, and I got that several times. And of course, taking pictures, that was even worse. But, you know, so that's what I wanted to add.
No, I think that's fair, and maybe I should have said it a little bit differently. I mean, communal experience, collective experience, for better or worse, you know. But the idea that this was something we all did together, and that all of these reflect that, and again, together for better or worse, and you know. But I wonder if anyone else has thoughts about how your projects reflect collective experience and what you hope people.
I found a lot of boundaries came down, that people were physically distancing, but were so longing for connection that though we couldn't touch each other, there was a lot of verbal communication. So, and noticing each other, and it's interesting to hear you say the people were angry that you were looking at them. And I found in the parks a lot of appreciative looking and looking back at people, and people saying like, I like your shoes, you know, what are you about? And people just talking to each other a lot. And then as things, you know, reopened and went back to normal, I felt like there was this closure of that. These walls came back up. So I think that was something I wish could continue.
I meant to say, by the way, I like your shoes.
Oh, thank you.
Well, we have a few questions from the audience, and couple first, Julie, about the Pandemic Diaries. You may have answered this, so forgive me, but someone wants to know how many hours were recorded and how will they be able to hear them eventually?
I think it was something around 400 hours of audio across almost 300 interviews, our diaries. Some were very short and some were much longer. I actually did about 60 interviews, so in addition to just letting people submit them cold, I also did like targeted outreach to particular groups, and those tended to be a little longer. I interviewed this guy right next to me, for example. The interesting thing about taking just a big wide net of people's audio is that you got to do a lot of careful review about them. The library is very careful when it comes to privacy, for example. So if there was anything in which the identity of a third party was identified, or if there were, for example, immigration status issues related with it, we did follow up with every single person that we flagged as having something potentially, problematic in terms of being able to make this available to the public, which was a lot of work, but also important work and amazing work. So they're going to be processed this year, and we hope to have them available to the public by the fall.
This is a nice follow-up, and it's super nerdy, but I feel like we're here in the library. So how do you catalog an oral history collection to make it able to be searchable so you can do research on it?
So the person who asked me that, let's talk afterwards, because I don't want to kill it with too much detail on this, but we're treating it as an archival collection, so it will get a finding aid. It will be described as a collection to preserve the kind of the provenance of the experience. And then each one will be available individually eventually on our digital collections. But if you have deeper questions, find me after.
This next question, I'm not sure which pandemic diary it's referencing, but I'm going to put it to you, Camilo, because I suspect you have more to say about this. But how does your pandemic diary address the homeless crisis during the pandemic?
I mean, what can I say? I got eyes. I use my eyes. I look and look and look and photograph and look at the pictures and then look some more and write about what I see, and that's the end of it. I'm not the mayor of the city. I don't run the country. But I want to tell you what is out there, and I want to be accurate. And that's as far as I go.
Can I answer that about my pandemic diaries?
I was about to ask if you would.
I actually think there's a really important lesson in this, which is that a 288 in 400 hours sounds like a lot, but it actually is more silences than stories. And I think it's always important for us to acknowledge the kind of limitations and the erasures of our project. And there are so many people whose stories we couldn't take and didn't take, right? And I think actually homeless people are a great example of that. How would we make a project like this available to capture their stories? There are probably lots of ways that we could, and particularly with follow-up, but at the moment, we didn't have the capacity to do that. And I think it's important for us to remember that there are lots of stories that are not in here. Another enormous hole for me is the experiences of elderly people in nursing homes. We got some stories of people who are adjacent to that, like the one that we listened to in the beginning, but that is an incredibly untold and undocumented story, like the experience of houseless people. And I think we have to be more creative and intrepid in thinking about ways that we're gonna preserve those stories for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm gonna turn back to one more question for all of you. And it's basically, I guess, is what do you all hope for these projects for the future? I mean, and maybe I'll start with you, Julie. I mean, because, you know, I as I was writing, I was like, is this a fair question to ask a librarian? Like, what you hope people do with researching something? But do you have hopes and dreams about what people do with these recordings?
Well, first, I hope they use them, because I think a theme that a lot of us have touched on tonight is this real collective and cultural turn away from studying and thinking deeply about the pandemic. I think that if, having listened to all of these stories, there is such a story of collective grief that we as a culture have not grappled with. And I think that maybe more than scholarship, I think there are like deeply therapeutic results of bearing witness to stories like this that I think would be an important, I think an essential way for them to be used. But mostly I just want people to come listen to them, as many people for as many reasons, and to write really thoughtful scholarship using them.
And what about you, Camilo? I mean, I know you talk on your website about how you for decades have been going to cities and photographing poor and segregated communities, same places time after time. So in a way, this feels almost like a sort of a small piece of a bigger project for you. Is that fair to say?
Well, it's a pretty big piece, because normally, you know, I would go to Chicago and spend a week there, and that would be my dealing with Chicago. In New York, I would maybe go once a week or twice a week, but this was an intense time when I would go every day. I also had new equipment that allowed me to do different things. So I wanted to get the thing unadulterated, just the way it is. So that basically meant that I would go to this crossroads, like 3rd Avenue and 149th Street in the Bronx. And you could see me crossing the streets with a camera high above, looking at the mirror, and then, you know, waiting for the crowd to come to me. I was like orchestrating the crowds. I wanted that the crowd that was coming from one side, from the other side, from the front, and then all come together to capture a mass of people. So I was photographing the face of New York, because there were 50 or 100 faces that had come in at random. And I was very happy to be able to be doing this. And I had thousands and thousands of pictures like this. And sometimes in some of those corners, I have selected 70 or 80 pictures that I have taken in that very same space during the pandemic. That's something I had never done in the same way. And, you know, it's just, how do you embrace the city? You know, how do you, you know, I mean, you can embrace an individual, you can embrace a child and everything. But this was the experience to me, and you know, at times I get some happiness out of it.
I love that. So do you think about what people are going to do with these photos, how they're going to take them in? Does that matter to you? Or is it just the doing of it, the documenting as it is?
I mean, people are using this stuff. You know, they're using it in classes. They just take it and use it. And, you know, they're welcome to do that. Unless they're making a pile of money, then I want them to cat me in. And that's happening too. So you know, I feel that my work ends here. You know, I just have to be as clear, as exact. I got to get out of my head, you know, whatever meaning comes out of this thing. I go to Google Street and go through that same corner and go and see it the year before and the year before and the year before. And then I can say more about the place in the caption. And you know, but that's the part that I can do. I can't go and rebuild some corner that just burned, or you know, or say that something is wrong, that the fridges don't have any food anymore. You know.
Yeah. And Julia, I mean, yours, it's a little different, right? Because it was sort of this finite project, and so I guess I'd put it to you slightly differently and ask if it's sort of impacted your subsequent work in any way.
I think it's a continuation. It's very much what I have been talking about through my work, and so it's definitely an expansion. But yeah, that resonates with me a lot. There's only so much that I can do, and so for me, it is focusing on my experiences and my friends, families, and the larger Asian and AAPI community. But I'm hoping that, you know, the conversation expands, that, you know, we talk about other similar experiences that many marginalized communities went through, right, when times got really tough. And so it's not just about my experience or my immediate community's experience, but that I'm hoping that we have a more expansive sense of community through hearing people's stories.
Absolutely. And Jeremiah, I'll leave it with you. Does any of this resonate with you in terms of how you think about what you want the book to do in the world?
Sure, yeah. I think I go back to the idea of the counter history, right? That, you know, I was day after day reading the New York Times during that first year. I was so frustrated by the insistence that the streets were empty, the streets were dying. And I would be like, I was just out there, like it's full of artists and activists and people who are creating community. And, you know, so I guess what I want people to take from this is, you know, there is this potential for another way for the city to be and for people to be together when the sort of, you know, juggernaut of progress and growth grinds to a halt. That makes room for lots of different human experiences and potential for, back to change, like change for the better, right? That and it's something that often comes out of crisis. Like humans can really come together and do something different.
You can't argue with ending on a hopeful note, so let's leave it there. Please give it up for all of tonight's speakers. Camilo José Vergara, Julie Golia, Jeremiah Moss, and Julia Kwon. And thank you, everybody, for being with us.